And I'm thrilled to tell you that our keynote speaker is here. She had to come from the wilds of New Jersey to get here. And Deb, we haven't even met yet. But is it all right with you if we come to you first, and then we'll do our awards after your presentation? Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, and anyone else who may be here, I do just want to tell you a little bit about our keynote speaker. I'm very excited to hear her. I can't resist telling you that, in parenthesis, that one of our sponsors came on board largely because he found out that Deb was our keynote speaker. So Deb Dagit is a sought-after consultant and speaker on the topics of diversity and inclusion. She started Deb Dagit Diversity LLC in 2013 to deliver the practical, just-in-time services and products she wished would have been available when she was a Chief Diversity Officer. As Merck's CEO, I'm trying to promote you. As Merck's CDO for almost 12 years, Deb was responsible for global equal opportunity employee relations, recruiting, and staffing diversity and inclusion. Under her leadership, the company was recognized for its exemplary work in diversity and inclusion by a wide range of business publications and government agencies and professional organizations. Prior to joining Merck, Deb was the leader of learning communications and diversity at Silicon Graphics and head of strategic cultural initiatives for Sun Microsystems. So she belongs at a tech conference. Yeah. She played a key role in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act through her lobbying efforts and testified before the U.S. Senate Health, Education, and Labor Sessions Committee in 2011 regarding best practices for improving employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Among her many awards, Ms. Dagit has received the 2010 Winds of Change Multicultural Forum on Workforce Diversity. I apologize for that. Multicultural Forum on Workforce Diversity. That's a fabulous award. Ms. Dagit earned a bachelor's degree with honors in psychology from Oregon State University and got her master's degree coursework in clinical psychology at San Jose State University. I am thrilled to present to you, in spite of all the stammers I just made, to hear from Ms. Dagit about the company's perspective, how it really works. Deb Dagit. Thank you.
So I want to apologize to the folks on my right over here because I'm behind a podium and you can't see me. So for those of you who can move your chairs, I can't go any further forward without coming off the stage. So, but I don't need to be rude. And so some of you will hear a disembodied voice if you're sitting to my right. So I really appreciate being invited here today. Thank you, Karen, for that kind introduction. And to Debbie and Mary Ellen, who are on the phone with me, helping me to understand more about this conference. Are you in the room? Raise your hand. I have a feeling they're here somewhere. And also to Brett Eisenberg, who originally asked me to come. And so I'm going to share three different perspectives with you today. One is as a person with a disability. I'm 4 feet tall and used to walk with a cane. Now I'm a full-time wheelchair user as of about 3 or 4 years ago due to a brittle bones condition called osteogenesis imperfecta. That's something Brett and I share in common. And I'll share a little bit about my personal experiences as a person with a disability in terms of my job experience applying and getting jobs. My experience as a job placement professional, it's a bit dated. It goes back to 1987 to 91. But now that I'm doing job placement again, I'm finding, for better or for worse, not a whole lot's changed since then. And then certainly my experiences in 3 different firms as a chief diversity officer for 22 years. And what it's like on the corporate side in terms of how candidates and job service providers need to think about how corporations deal with candidate referrals and their careers website. So first a little bit about me personally. I was born in 1959. I guess some of us who get over the age of 50 and get your ARC card try to, hide that. But I'm perfectly comfortable with my age. And what's important about that is when I was going through school, there was not a requirement that people with disabilities could go to regular public school. And in kindergarten and first grade, I went to a segregated school for children with disabilities out in California. And that was not a place where I was going to be able to get a competitive education. The focus was really on providing care for severely disabled children, and there really wasn't a whole lot of curriculum. And my mother was really concerned as a single mom. She wanted me to get a competitive education, and so she talked a local school principal and a second grade teacher into letting me go to a regular school. And there was a caveat though. First of all, I had to get straight A's, no bones about it. And I have 5 brothers, and if they got C's, that was fine. But I needed to get all A's. And because they were concerned about the insurance risk, I needed to sit right next to the teacher's desk and stay in the classroom during recess and lunch. So my best friends were the kids in trouble. so that stayed with me throughout my schooling. If it wasn't a requirement of the school, it was always a requirement of my mom, who was a working class, as I said, single mom, that I get straight A's. Because unlike my brother, she knew that any job that I would get would have to rely on my having the skills necessary to compete for jobs. And so that stayed with me through graduate school. I was hospitalized a lot with fractures and surgeries, so I missed a lot of school that I had to make up through tutors. And I don't know if this is still the case for people who have to rely on tutors, but I found that they weren't so hot in the math and science area. They tended to focus on the liberal arts. And as a lot of kids who spend a lot of time in the hospital, I really wanted to be a physician when I grew up. Those were my idols. And I wasn't daunted at all by having brittle bones or being short. I just figured I'd figure it out. I didn't want to be an orthopedic physician. I thought there's all kinds of things you can do at my level. So, and as for those of you who watch television, you know that there's a Dr. Jen, who's much smaller than I am, who's a very successful physician on TV. But due to the lack of math and science, by the time I got to college, I just couldn't even pass the most basic courses in physics and math. So I switched over to clinical psychology, which I really enjoyed. It had a biochemistry and neuroanatomy, a lot of the things I was interested in, and so that's what I pursued through graduate school. And when I was going to school, I did any kind of job I could get. And back then, for women in particular, a lot of us were using the typing skills. I know that sounds foreign to a lot of younger generations now, but we were taught to use all of our fingers in high school rather than hunt and peck. And I was a fairly good typist, and like a lot of girls my age, the only jobs we could get, even with undergrad or graduate degrees, were some type of a secretarial or administrative assistant role. And we called ourselves the pink collar brigade of people who really wanted to get, bigger jobs. And I had decided, rather than to become a clinical psychologist, I would use my training in human resources. There is a lot of applications for psychology and HR. And I had applied for many jobs in HR above an administrative position, but at the time, and this was between 83 and 87, I was blatantly told there didn't seem to be any concern at all from a legal perspective that I was lucky to have a job, and that, you know, people who look like me can't be in leadership roles. And so in 1987, there was a law that was passed called COBRA. Many of you are probably familiar with it, which allows you to take your benefits with you. And when that happened, I decided to leave the company I was at, a very large semiconductor company. And I asked some of my friends, okay, I've got, you know, some HR experience, because while I was there, even though it was at an administrative level, they let me do all kinds of interesting things, from creating affirmative action plans to recruiting candidates, a little bit of HR generalist support. So I've learned, you know, a fair amount about HR. And I had redone their whole temporary job posting system, just all kinds of different things. And so I asked a friend, look at somebody with a degree in psychology who's been active in the nonprofit world for people with disabilities and has some HR experience too. And she said, well, you could probably place people with disabilities into jobs. So I started looking at the different organizations that do that. There's the government agencies, which some of you may be associated with, either directly through the Department of Voc Rehab or indirectly because you're funded through DVR. There is all kinds of nonprofits, and there, at the time where I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was actually a firm that was for-profit that placed people with disabilities into jobs called Project Hired. There's one now that's national called Vendor Consulting. So there are a few of those. And as I looked into them, I was really taken aback at how much paperwork was involved. It seemed like I was spending more time filling out papers than I was in trying to find people jobs. And one of the things that really puzzled me, and I'm going to be, I was told by Karen and others that I could be pretty direct here, so I'm going to do that. I was a little surprised that many of the people in job placement positions had never worked inside of a corporation and were not particularly familiar with the requirements inside of companies. Well, I think the folks that were in these roles and are in these roles today do a fabulous job of getting people ready to work. If you don't know how things work inside of a corporation, it's really hard to get a recruiter's attention. And the other thing I found really puzzling is that if you are a person with a disability and you go to the employment office where everybody else goes to get a job, and at this time, all companies were required to put all of their jobs online with the employment office. You get turned away if you're a person with a disability and you go to the employment office. You get told to go to the Voc Rehab department. And that just didn't seem right. So I actually petitioned the governor of California at the time, Duke Majan, a Republican, and said I wanted a demonstration grant to show how employment offices could place people with disabilities into jobs and give them another channel, another alternative. At first, they refused to even see me, but when I threatened a lawsuit on behalf of people with disabilities in the state of California, and so I had a desk, and I formed a coalition with all of the other service providers in the Bay Area. It was called the Bay Area Coalition for the Employment of People with Disabilities. We called it BACT for short. And what we did was I set up in my office, I said, look, you send me your candidates who need jobs. I'm not funded the same way you are, so we can both get quote-unquote credit for the placement. I can get credit through the state of California, you through however you're funded. Send me all your candidates. I'll spend a half hour with each one, and I want to see that they are ready to go to work. They have a good resume, they're good at interviewing, they really want to work, they're not worried about their medical benefits or their SSDI. They can get to and from the job, and once that's the case, I will make sure that they're connected with all the great employers. And Apple Computer gave us a grant and a server. And then I hired an assistant, and what we did is we retyped all the jobs that came in every day into this antiquated computer system at the employment office into these Apple computers. This was when Apple was just starting to get big and threaten IBM. And we would send to all the backed agencies these jobs. And we just ramped up tremendously. By the time I left, we were placing 400 people a year with all different kinds of disabilities into full-time competitive employment. And it was a lot of fun. And one of the things that we did was the backed agencies all met once a month for a half a day. And we really challenged each other to share and make sure all boats rise, to share candidates, to share jobs, to do everything we could so that we were all performing at the same level of delivery on behalf of businesses in making good job matches with strong candidates, and on behalf of candidates in giving them what they needed to be competitive. So that was, my foray into job placement. And I think that that's something I really want to recommend, is that coalitions form. I know that in New York there is a coalition of folks that are here in this room who are all about helping people who are blind and visually impaired to get jobs. And so I think that's great. And hopefully during the workshop this afternoon we can talk about some additional tools and tips to get to those really high job placement rates. The other thing I'll just briefly mention about my experience back in the day is, as Karen said, like a lot of people who are my age and who have been advocates for people with disabilities, I was part of the advocacy for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know it seems like everybody my age who's in this field says, oh, I was there and I made it happen. I honestly did only play a small role. My Congressman Norm Mineta was a key co-sponsor of the bill, and he was aware of the work I was doing. And when there were weakening amendments proposed, he would send me to his colleagues' offices in DC and help them to see through what we were doing with the agency that I led. It was called Bridge. And that was effective. So I got invited to the South Lawn of the White House the day the ADA was signed. It was humid and hot as all get out. And of course there were a lot of long lines to get in through the Secret Service. And it was just really cool. There were 2,000 people that day on the South Lawn. And one of the freakiest things that's ever happened to me is I had a premonition on the plane flying out that I was going to personally meet the president. And I was asking myself, what would I say if he walked up to me, you know? And knowing there's 2,000 people there, I should have thought that couldn't happen. But I obviously had that premonition and thought I should, think of what I'm going to say. And sure enough, he comes down off the platform, walks directly up to me out of all these people, shakes my hand and says, "Congratulations, young lady." And of course, despite all my thinking on the plane, the only thing I could think of to say is, "Thank you, Mr. President." So it was a grand day, which is almost 25 years ago, and I was so optimistic that this was going to be the major turning point for people with disabilities. And what happened was I decided, okay, now that this law is in place, where can I have the greatest impact? And I realized that you really need a tall soapbox, especially if you're a little person, to be able to make things happen. And so I decided to go back into the corporate world. Now, as I mentioned to you, when I left, I was not making a whole heck of a lot of money as an administrative assistant in 1987. In 1991, I was hired by Sun Microsystems, a large Silicon Valley company, to be their first chief diversity officer as an executive. So that was a trip. And the reason they hired me is, first they hired me as a consultant to get them into compliance with the ADA. Well, that took 5 minutes. I mean, it really wasn't that hard. I hired a person with a disability who was an engineer to make sure all their technology was accessible. I worked with their recruiters, and really there just wasn't a whole lot else to do to get the wheels in motion. But diversity as a field was just starting out then. So when I looked around and thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my day, I noticed that they were spending tens of thousands of dollars on these glossy slick ads in all of these different magazines to talk about how committed they were to hiring diverse candidates. And just having come out of a nonprofit organization where we counted every penny, I was appalled. I thought, why would you do that? It was called good faith. And I guess at that time, what was normative is if you were going through an audit with the OFCCP, you would show them all the magazines and all your really cool ads. And I asked, are we getting any hires from any of these ads? And no one seemed to even know. So I called all of the folks who led the different diversity grassroots teams. They're called employee resource groups together. Hispanic, African American, the LGBT group, the veterans group, the Asian group, the women's group. And I brought everyone together in a room, and I called the advertising company, Bernard Hodes, who was really pleased to have Sun as a client. And I had them bring copies of all of the magazines that we had placed these ads in. So I fed everybody a lunch, pizza and soda and chocolate chip cookies. And I had a friend of mine who's a photographer come in and take pictures of this meeting. And first I introduced them to the kind folks at Bernard Hodes, and then I said, first of all, I'd like you to take a look at all these magazines. Are any of these on your coffee tables? Nope, nobody heard of any of them. Good, okay, what do you think about these ads? Would this compel you to come work at Sun? And they said, no, it looks really staged, it doesn't look authentic, these aren't even people from our community, that kind of thing. And so I said, okay, let's try this. And now remember, I'm still a contractor, and I'm somehow getting away with this. I said, let's try this. Bernard Hodes, our next ad is going to go in one publication for each community, and I asked the people in the room to say, what is on your coffee table? And I said, this is what the ad's going to look like. It's going to be pictures from this meeting here today, and it's going to be like a scrapbook. And it's going to say, we're really committed to diversity. We're not there yet, but if you'd like to join us on the journey to become the #1 place to work for all people, come join us. Well, the ad didn't cost hardly anything. The placements cost a whole lot less. And we won all kinds of awards for this terrific ad, and I got a Chief Diversity Officer job. So that was the CEO was a very bold gentleman, young man, one of the youngest CEOs ever at the time. And so he's the one that said, he wanted someone like me on his team. And so it was a really fun but short journey at Sun. Because 2 years later, one of their direct competitors, Silicon Graphics, they're the folks that make the visualization that's possible for everything from medical imaging equipment to the cool movie that Pixar makes. And they were a really fun company. It was during the heyday of when Silicon Valley was just booming. And that was a really fun ride when SGI recruited me. I loved being courted and hired and being able to do lots of really cool things as a diversity leader there. And this was always inclusive of disability. I always made that at the same level of importance. Now, I will tell you that I was always concerned that because I was the only person that I ever met with a visible disability, or even a person that owned that they had any kind of disability, visible or otherwise, at any kind of diversity meeting, I was worried that I'd be pigeonholed as only caring about disability. And what was interesting about being an N of 1 is that from the time I got my first job as a diversity leader, I got invited to every diversity party. Because I was the only one you could invite if you wanted to include disability that anyone knew of. So when I was still learning how to do the job, literally, I got invited to everything. And if I couldn't afford to pay for the travel and hotel out of my budget, they usually paid for it, just so they'd have somebody in the room representing our community. So that really accelerated my visibility and my learning curve. People who hear the name of my business now, Deb Dagit Diversity LLC, think I must be terribly egotistical. But the reality is, after doing it for 22 years and unfortunately remaining an N of 1 that whole time, just about everybody in the diversity field knows who I am, because I'm the only one rolling in. Anyway, that was, my experience in Silicon Valley, and towards the end of the 90s, things kind of blew up in the valley, and a lot of jobs went away, and it became kind of a dangerous place to stake your career in, because companies were disappearing left and right. And I kind of wanted to get back into healthcare. You remember, I wanted to be a doctor at one point. I had a clinical psychology degree. And so I started looking at healthcare companies. And at the time, the mantra was, well, no matter what happens with the economy, everybody's going to need their drugs. So find a drug company. So I started interviewing out on the East Coast. And in 2000, on my 40th birthday, I was flown out to a company in New York City, not in pharmaceuticals, but in financial services, to interview for their Chief Diversity Officer job. And they flew me out first class. They put me up in a 5-star hotel. They sent a stretch limo for me. They had been talking to me on the phone. They had seen my resume. And when I, at the time, walked in with my cane to meet the recruiter at the beginning of what was supposed to be 2 full days of interviews, they took one look at me, canceled all the interviews, and said, we're not moving forward. And as they were making arrangements to send me home, they said, what we're thinking might work here is there's a really high-profile individual, an African-American man who doesn't have any experience in diversity and inclusion, but we think he'd be a really good spokesperson on behalf of our family or our company. What if we hired him and then you did all the work behind the scenes? That sounded an awful lot like my early career experience as a so-called administrative assistant doing all kinds of other HR things, and of course that wasn't of any interest to me. Shortly after that, I was asked to speak at a conference on spirituality in the workplace at Babson College. And it was a conference that was very interesting because my entire audience was rabbis and individuals who are leaders of every possible type of faith, theologians from every faith. And they wanted to, have me talk about diversity in the church. And quite frankly, I gave them a pretty hard time. I said, I don't participate in any organized religion because I find that whoever is preaching at the front of the church has a tendency to say things that are negative about my group, people with disabilities, there but for the grace of God go we. The gay community, many of my closest and dearest friends are gay. Women and what their proper role is, and people who are of different faiths that aren't going to get to heaven because they're not in their church. So I said, quite frankly, if you want to think about diversity, you really need to rethink about your inclusion strategy with who's in your audience. You're like the CEO of your church. So despite my having probably offended pretty much everybody in the room, I said, I'm flying from here, Boston, to a company in New Jersey, Merck Pharmaceuticals, and I'm wondering if you all in your various faiths would say a prayer for me. And I told them about my experience with the New York City firm and said I'm really not up for a repeat performance. And so when I got to Merck, it was a very imposing facility, marble floors and mahogany and statues. And as the young man who was the recruiter responsible for my full day of interviews came down the stairs, he took one look at me and almost fell down the stairs. I thought, uh-oh. So then they put me in a conference room at the time my first interview was supposed to start and said, we're going to be getting started a little bit later. My phone rang and the recruiter who had interviewed, the external recruiter, the job placement person who had referred me said, they just fired me. Because I didn't tell them you are a person with a disability. So I'm thinking, uh-oh. So I start to go through the interviews, and what was really interesting is they had never had a diversity leader before. And so instead of them interviewing me, I spent all the interviews trying to explain to them what a diversity person does, where it should report, what should report to it, what it can do for the business and the company, how it aligns with a pharmaceutical company, why it's important for you to do this work. And by 3 o'clock that afternoon, they added a new interview on my agenda. It was the general counsel for the company, a very tall, handsome African-American man named Ken Frazier. And Ken ushers me into his office, shuts the door, sits down, and says, "You must have had one hell of a day." And I said, "Well, it's been interesting." And he said, "Okay, I know that it probably was rocky, but, you really impressed everyone, and they want to know if I can close you and hire you today." And I said, "No, that's not going to work. I have to spend some time with the CEO and some of the other direct reports. I have to see if you're serious about doing this work. Do you need a Volkswagen or a Maserati? Because I'm a Maserati, and if you need a Volkswagen, I'll refer some other candidates." And I'm not talking about a Jetta. I'm thinking about my mom's Bug back in the 60s. And so, I really didn't want to go to a company that wanted window dressing. And so he arranged for me to come back a month later and have the interviews that I needed to have and get the commitment that I needed. And I did end up starting at Merck in June of 2001. And it was a trip in so many ways, because being from California, where everyone's all mixed up, and if you're driving down the El Camino Real, there's every possible form of diversity in the businesses, in the restaurants, and just about anything. And I was so shocked. I felt like I'd moved to a different country when I went from Silicon Valley to New Jersey. People living in enclaves, so that, there was the Italian community, the Polish community. Out in Silicon Valley, if you ask a white person what their ethnicity is, they always say something like Heinz 57. I have no idea, right? So for white people to be, claiming that they needed a diversity initiative because they're Irish or Italian was shocking to me. I also was fascinated that we were still referring to the gay community as homosexuals and Asians as Orientals. And I thought, OMG, do I have my work cut out. So it was like a walk back in time. But the general counsel, who's now the CEO, he said, "Look, I have your back. As this proceeds, if you run into any challenges, just call on me." And so from the get-go, we included disability in our diversity hiring initiatives, and we became the leader very quickly in that area. Unfortunately, it still is all too easy to be amazing in the disability hiring space, because there's only a handful of companies that do it extremely well. And I tell all companies who are now my clients that the magic ingredients are: you must have an easy-to-use and well-communicated reasonable accommodations process. You must have relationships with sources of talent. And you must have a inclusion practice that is similar to the gay community, where you encourage allies for people with disabilities, who make it possible for people to be out and proud as a person with a disability. And so that's something I emphasize all the time. In fact, I created a program that you can see on my website, where people can buy a video and an instructor's guide and learn how to foster allies in the disability community, and what do allies do. 71% of disabilities are non-apparent, including people who are blind and have low vision. I have a good friend, some of you may know of her if you haven't had the opportunity to meet her, Caroline Casey. She runs Kanchi. She's the woman who rode the elephants through India. Anyway, she does speeches. She has a TED Talk, and she's a person who's blind, and I don't know how she does it, but she wears, stiletto heels and wanders around without a guide dog or a white cane, and is not magnificently bruised. But she's a person with a non-apparent disability. She has some creative skills, I think, in that regard. So at any rate, when I was at Merck, we installed all those things. And since I've started my own company, that's what I do, is I teach firms how to do all aspects of diversity, but inclusive of disability. And I really focus on non-apparent disabilities. I'm just looking at my notes to see what else I wanted to share with you here. One of the things that I find really fascinating is I really resisted becoming a wheelchair user for a long time. I probably should have started using one a good 4 to 5 years earlier than I did. Finally, I had a really bad fall, broke both legs, and the orthopedist said, the only place you're walking is in water. So I have a pool down in my basement, a little above ground pool. That's an advantage of being short-statured. You can put an above-ground pool inside, and you don't bump your head on the ceiling when you climb into it. In the bottom of the pool is a treadmill, and so I stay relatively fit by jogging in the water every day. But I was reluctant to become a wheelchair user because of environmental challenges associated with that. And one thing I didn't bargain for is when I started using a wheelchair, everybody treated me like I was a Make-A-Wish person, like I wasn't going to be with the world much longer. When are you going to get better? I'm so sorry you're still so ill. I was just so shocked that people had that reaction. But I love being a wheelchair user for so many reasons. One, I can carry lots of stuff without hurting myself, right? Including all my husband's stuff and our service dog and all that. I am able to go a lot faster than most people when they're walking. And people are much more likely in a place like New York not to walk all over me, which happened a lot when I was a little person with a cane. So I find also that when you are a wheelchair user, you're always comfortable. When I was sitting in regular chairs, I either look like, now this is for people who are baby boomers. There was a show back in the 60s, I think, maybe the 70s too, called Laugh-In. Yes. And there was a character named Edith Ann, played by Lily Tomlin, who sat in this giant rocking chair, and you can see the soles of her feet, right? When she clicked her toes together periodically like little kids do. That's how I felt whenever I sat back in a chair. So what I would do is sit on the edge of the chair so that my toes could touch the floor. Well, in the business world, you often are sitting in a meeting all day long. Day after day after day. And now that I'm a wheelchair user, I am sitting in a seat that is ergonomically correct and comfortable, and I can give a presentation like this and not have, my feet, my legs, my back aching. So I just say that to say, it's too bad that the way we view orthopedic equipment is so negative. So I'm getting that wrap it up sign. Let me close by just saying a few things very quickly. I think with 503, we and the affirmative action requirements of a 7% aspirational goal and the requirements for self-identification, we're finally going to move the needle, because 25 years after the ADA, we know that now people with disabilities are at the same or even lower employment rate than they were back when the ADA passed. If you are not already involved in the U.S. Business Leadership Network, I strongly encourage you to get involved. There are local BLMs in most communities. And at the national level, they're a really strong advocate for people with disabilities. As suppliers, for customers, and they have a certification program if you're a disability-owned business, similar to women, veterans, and minority-owned businesses. Soon, and I'm going to send information to Karen and her team, there's going to be a resource that everyone in this room can use, whether you're looking for a position, or you're a provider of job placement services, if you go to a website called OUR Ability, there's going to be a tool similar to LinkedIn that goes on that, where you can put your information in. Our goal is to get at least 5,000 candidates with disabilities into that system by July 1st, and then we're going to market it to all employers nationally. So I know that DDR has a system called NET. I think it's great, but not everybody has access to it. It requires that you be a DDR client. And we want this system to be out there for everyone, and you can be in both places. But we are going to heavily promote this in communities, not only people who are hooked up with job placement agencies, but also people who belong to organizations like my husband and I, like Little People of America, the OI Foundation, the MS Society, United Cerebral Palsy, the Spinal Association, so that even if you're a person who's currently employed and you would like one of the competitors of the place that you currently work to try to recruit you away, like SGI did with me at Sun, we've got a system out there for those folks as well. So I know I've gone past my time. I thank you for your kind attention.
Conference coordinator par excellence, Mr. Reed. Do we have time for 2 questions?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. If you want to ask a question, we only can do 2 because we really have. Thank you, Deb. I didn't say that, but fabulous.
Thank you.
So, if you want to raise your hand, I'm not going to call on you, but probably somebody will.
Good.
Have the websites been checked for accessibility with screen readers?
Yes. The question was, has the website been checked? Both USBLN and Our Ability Connect will be fully accessible for all different disability types. And my website is as well. And if you go to it and it's not like amazingly accessible in every way, send me an email and I'll fix it, because that was my intent.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm interested in finding out about meetings, especially in Long Island, since I'm a person of disability that owns their own business.
Yeah, so you can definitely get certified through the USBLN if you go to their website. I'm a certified disability-owned business, and I believe there is a business leadership network in Long Island, and you can find out who's the leader of that if you go to their website, USBLN.
That's 2. Deb, thank you so much.